Good evening, everyone, and welcome to day 9 of Caribbean Women Honors and Empowerment's 16 Days of Activism interview series. My name is Wendy H. Lewis, and I will be the one introducing the host, and then you will see me again in 30 minutes when we do the live Q&A from our Facebook Live. I want to say a special good evening to our Facebook Live audience as I introduce our host for this evening's interview, Mrs. Marsha Bailey Owen, who is a gifted individual who has a passion for service and children. Mrs. Bailey Owen is the holder of a bachelor's in social work with minors in psychology and social policy. At the postgraduate level, Mrs. Bailey Owen holds a master's degree in social work with specialization in administration and management. Her career began in the public sector in the area of family intervention, moving on to child protection. As a social work professional, Mrs. Bailey Owen has managed social service agencies and social workers in the public sector. Mrs. Bailey Owen's social work experiences ranges from clinical interventions to social work management, policy formulation, and human resources management. Mrs. Bailey Owen is a founding member of Caribbean Women Honors and Empowerment Trinidad and Tobago chapter and has served as Vice Chair and Social Services Director for the past 5 years. Let's welcome Mrs. Bailey Owen,
Thank you so much. Good evening,
who's
everyone.
looking ever rutical this evening.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Welcome, welcome. And Mrs. Bailey Owen will be interviewing someone that I know personally this evening who is also a social worker. So allow me to introduce our guest. Ms. Samantha Griffith is a qualified social worker and business administration professional with over 8 years experience advocating and seeking justice on behalf of victims of gender-based violence. Ms. Griffith worked and excelled in a male-dominated environment, namely the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, as a victim and witness support officer and project coordinator, respectively, within the Victim and Witness Support Unit. Ms. Griffith assisted with the development and implementation of policy, training, and development activities, including the designing of community awareness programs and initiatives. She also provided psychosocial and investigative support to victims and witnesses of crime. Ms. Griffith prides herself as a passionate advocate who uses her skills to empower others. Let's welcome Ms. Samantha Griffith.
Hi, everyone. Good evening.
Good
Welcome,
evening.
welcome, welcome, Samantha. Samantha, I'm going to disappear and I'm going to
Oh,
leave you in the ever capable hands of Mrs. Bailey Owen.
no problem. See you soon.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And so, if we may begin, Samantha, it is good to introduce us fellow social worker.
Yes.
But for persons who don't always understand what we do, and when we talk about advocating, and I saw in your bio that part of your remit and part of what you do would be as an advocate for persons who are victims of gender-based violence and domestic violence. So tell in layman's word, what are some of the things that you do when you advocate to help persons understand how we move persons from point A to point B?
Well, in layman's terms, I would begin by saying roughing up the system
Right.
and really aggressively going after issues in the system and speaking on behalf of those who are voiceless in our society to let them know or let their voices be heard, because sometimes they are lost within bureaucracies, they are lost within particular very stringent policies. So we as social workers really seek to put ourselves in their positions and then speak on their behalf, more or less. That's what the advocacy is about. And advocacy doesn't end, as I said, in terms of just speaking, but as I said earlier, roughing up the system. So you
Right.
really have to go in there, look at the system, look at what gaps are existing, looking at what our client population needs, those who are downtrodden in society, or even those who, because people believe social workers only deal with persons who may be poverty stricken or below
Correct. Correct.
in those particular areas. But as anybody, any class, we don't discriminate about persons, race, gender, and really looking at the systems and how they are not accommodating those persons and fearlessly going after those gaps and seeking how we can assist in terms of reforming them, changing them completely and radically doing that. So for me, that's what advocacy in a very layman's term, the rougher part about is for me for advocacy.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
And so if you can just think, and I know you may have numerous examples that you can pull from, but one of the things I always hear persons say that working with persons who are exposed to gender-based violence is sometimes so very difficult, because when we think we made two steps forward, two steps back. So, we would have set up a plan for them to leave, or you would have networked and you would have called a colleague somewhere. And I see that you were in victim support. So that is in the police setting. So if you can use one example where there was a success story, where working with that client, you would have been able to move her from really recognizing I am a victim, but I can move on to be a survivor.
Yeah, and that's a really good, the first part in terms of you saying, these victims, people could see them as maybe difficult.
Right.
You said, you develop these plans for them with and alongside them, because we don't just develop it in silos, but with the clients, and
Correct.
then they believe, okay, 2 weeks later, she's saying, no, I don't want to leave. Or you ensure that the safe house is there. So I wanted to really, I liked how you started, and I just want to talk about that, or touch on that a little bit, and then go to the success story,
Oh,
because
excellent.
I want persons to know, because victims of gender-based, and I would pinpoint domestic violence, because we know there are different categories of gender-based violence crimes, but I want to pinpoint domestic violence because sometimes, and even sexual offenses to an extent, but domestic violence specifically, because of the cycle of domestic violence,
Right.
that cycle, the honeymoon phase. So the perpetrator, after the explosion, the perpetrator then becomes who they remember, and they fall back into that groove. And then domestic violence is all about power and control. So when I control your money, I control your movements, etc. And persons who understand how difficult in that psyche that becomes for that person. And you could even look at some things like conditioning. Is almost as though it's conditioning someone to be like that. Um, so I wanted to address that part first, and why it's so difficult sometimes, or it's perceived as difficult when we deal with victims of, let's specifically talk about domestic violence.
Right.
And maybe later on we could look at my interactions with the police, how we've overcome that perception
Yeah.
of maybe they're difficult later on. But let me tell you about the success story. So I had a young lady who was in a domestic violence situation, two children, unemployed at the time, and her husband was, licks for over about 5 years period, 5 year period. He was also abusive to the children.
Wow.
Some persons may say, well, he might be beating her, but he's not beating the children. But this person was beating both her and the children.
Right.
Um, and it was littered with, she's unemployed, she has these children to care for, small children, and he was the sole breadwinner. We had to then, she wanted to leave, she was determined to leave. We ensured that she made a police report, she got the protection order. We looked at safety planning with her, we looked at linking her to the different social agencies. We eventually also looked at what skills does she have,
Right.
what academic background, or anything that she possesses that can be of value, and we could use that and levy that to get her a job. And we did get her a job. She stayed in the safe home for some time. During the safe home, they too, because we have to ensure we link with our stakeholders, they too would have worked with her. And eventually, when she got the protection order, and she went back and forth for some time, we would
Yes.
admit, because that does happen. And then eventually she said enough, it was enough after about a year period, and she left. After the back and forth with the safe home, after the back and forth with not wanting the protection order, and then, breaches of the protection order. And she's one of our living, breathing success stories.
Nice. Excellent.
Because, and the children who would have gotten support, because, once they witness and are victims of abuse, they too need some support.
Yes.
Because
They
they
too are
can,
victims.
yep, or end up being the cycle continue, that you believe that it's okay for daddy to be beating mommy, or vice versa, and you become a perpetrator.
Yes.
But as
And
I
so
said,
there are success stories,
yeah,
and this is one of the messages that we want. And I was glad that you spoke about that domestic violence is just only one type of gender-based violence. I mean, we have so many others, but for us in Trinidad, I think a lot of the emphasis is really on our domestic violence cases, and people really need to understand that it's not just an overnight fix. it's really getting into the mind and the psyche of the individuals and helping them to come along. But you spoke about the police, and that has always been, even for the public, one of the very touchy areas, because I have witnessed firsthand as a social worker myself, going to a police station, and the perpetrator is a man in this instance, and the officers would be saying to both of them, you know, oh, boy, cool yourself now, almost minimalizing what was happening in the home, what was happening in the situation, and not really paying full attention and getting across the message that you indicated, that it is about power and control, and he obviously had the power. And so if you could talk to us a little bit about what happens at the stations. Do you think that is sometimes a deterrent for the woman not wanting to actually make a report or go to the station?
Right. Well, I want to talk about it from my experience during my stint as a victim support officer,
Right.
and then briefly as the project coordinator with Gender-Based Violence Unit. Not talking on their behalf, but talking from my experience in terms of working
Yes.
there. Sometimes it can be a deterrent. However, I know the police service, under the leadership of Mr. Gary Griffith, is working really, really hard to change that culture, because it's a culture change, putting policies as well as, particular procedures, revise the procedures, and also marrying that with what is in legislation and the law. Because, we recently had amendments that gave the police some serious powers to treat with domestic violence related matters. As a victim support officer, yes, during that time we did see some problems, but it is a matter of us working together with the police to identify what it is in terms of is happening, in terms of, are we lacking resources, are we lacking training, do they understand fully domestic violence, are they themselves victims of domestic violence? When it's a basis of customer service, when you come into the station, how do you speak to persons, especially victims of domestic violence, that require a particular type of sensitivity? And it goes back to, as well, when you said domestic violence victims, could be perceived, well, in my words, as I'm just kind of bridging what you were saying, as difficult, because of that cycle of abuse. So you have to allow or help persons understand, our service providers, that it is a cycle. It is in terms of a psychological as well conditioning, as I mentioned before. And how do we treat with those things? What tools do we have to treat with those things? So when our victim comes to make a report 10 times, you have to treat the report just as serious as the first time.
The first time, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Because the 10th time when you tell her, well, go back home to your husband, or, you keep coming here. We helped you 10 times before, you still want a safe house. Things like that could be said, that the 10th time could have been the time that she dies. So your intervention needs to be as serious as the first time. Yeah. And also understanding too, there may be lack of resources with safe homes. So it doesn't only fall, or the service doesn't only fall within the police remit. So yes, they are the first responders in terms of law enforcement, but you look at the other services as well, and what is happening, and what gaps and inefficiencies there may be when the police service, let's say, do conduct, which they do, or the service delivery is effective and they make a intervention at that time. What about when the battle is passed on to the other services?
Correct.
Because a police officer might say, well, they charge a person now, where are you going for the safe house?
And the safe house full.
Yes, and it's operated by external entities. So there are frustrations or gaps on all sides as well. And how do we treat with those gaps? And as I said, during my time as a victim support officer, my stint with TTPS, they have been making a lot of strides to treat with those particular gaps from their policing side or law enforcement side. Even the establishment of the Gender-Based Violence Unit, that is testimony to their resolve to treat with those particular type of issues. Having a dedicated unit with specialized officers to treat with domestic violence victims specifically, because they recognize that is a specific or a special client need population that requires there's sensitivity, as I said before. Your level of customer service needs to be much different, because she may come to our station, and we hear it sometimes in the newspaper. She come to the station, but you don't have any reports. Because she may have come, look around, she may have been brave enough to come, but then leave.
Correct, because she didn't see or feel the need. Look, I really can't do this. Or
Yeah.
sometimes
Oh, I'm overwhelmed, I don't want to do it.
I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
One victim I remember, she said when she walked in, she said the person actually at the desk was a friend of the perpetrators, and she just made a roundabout turn. And I said, but why didn't you go to another station? And she said, look, if it could have been one friend there could have been another friend somewhere else. And so they really come in some instances, but just for whatever reason, don't always make a report.
Yeah, and also too, when I was there, TTP has made some changes, because we recognized one at that time, and I'm saying we, because I still feel as though I'm part of TTPS, different reporting types that may be helpful for victims of DV. So you're looking at, you have the app, so it's anonymous. You're looking at COVID, so you may not physically be able to go to the station because you're on the perpetrator home all the time now, but you have the app. You have your 2-4 diary. Then you have the traditional thing, 9999 reporting system, where you call. So all of those things, and 555. So all of those things too are innovative ways we can make reports, and victims feel a little less scared or intimidated to make a report. But sometimes too, when victims come to the station, which is already intimidating,
Yes.
people might look a kind of way, but our officers too have to pinpoint those persons and see, okay, she's looking a little scared in the corner. How can I help you, ma'am? And pull her aside. You know, you're going through something, talk to me. So it's all of those types of sensitivity and customer service things that we really need to look at, and they are, and giving that specialized support to those types of victims.
Oh, excellent. So while Wendy was reading your bio, I noticed you spoke about policy formulation, and this is one of the areas that, we always want to know what's happening behind the scenes, what's happening to sensitize the public, or to just put things in written form to be able to assist those persons who are victims. What have been some of the policies that, if you can share, that you would have worked on, that you've seen, it really benefiting? Because, sometimes we have a lot of policies and sometimes it's just there on a shelf looking lovely, but it's really not being implemented or enacted or anything being done with it.
All right, so we were building out in terms of our community initiatives, one of the policies in terms of community engagement with victims of gender-based violence. We're looking at in terms of having, if you see often on particular apps or in the newspapers, us getting the message out there about how to report. Yes. Getting out there information about keeping yourself safe, especially during COVID. So all of those things were part of a communication package that we were rolling out. Looking at training and development policies and having protocols in place for those particular things in terms of referral processes externally as well as internally, with our external stakeholders. Looking at networking with persons on the judiciary side as well, in terms of now they have a domestic violence reporting aspect where you can call because of the COVID as well, and they too taking stock of what is happening. So those were some of the policies or MOUs, if you want to call it, that they were implementing at that time. Even with victim support, they were implementing some policies, but I don't want to speak on that as much because I would have left, and I'm not too up to date at this point, obviously, because I'm not internally involved anymore. But those were some of the broad policies that I could talk about that we were trying to implement in terms of our communication packages, stakeholder engagement and involvement, internal referral processes. So those are some of the policies we were trying to get on stream, or they have been making strides to get on stream and implement throughout.
Okay, and during all this time, is the input of victims, because as you know, Cha, we do our share of interventions with some victims, and one of the things, in particular, one member is sticking in my head, when she always talks about, but nobody asks us what should be done. Nobody asks us how can we do this better. We are the ones who live through it in terms of the victims, and nobody seems to ask. So did you all include in your consultations the impact it may have on survivors? I don't like to say victims, on survivors.
Yeah, of course they did. And they also looked at, I think, when you look at qualitative and quantitative, so you look at data, you look at in terms of trends, because your data will generate, trends in terms of high risk areas, in terms of what type of interventions you would need, because particular areas may have higher numbers of DV, or even particular areas may have lower numbers, but there's a reason for that in terms of the quality of the area.
That's right, not being reported.
Yes, or in terms of the culture of the community, like in terms of when we talk about incest and all of those things are not being very hidden. In terms of, so for example, what I would have noticed when I was looking at developing particular things, I noticed that Tobago had a increase in reporting. If during the years when we looked at the stats, it was a little lower, but Tobago started to have an increase. So that means there was some trust or level of trust happening between the public as well as that agency. So people were reporting more, but before that was a very underreported thing. So you look at those trends as well. So, and then you involve your survivors. Yes, we do. So through stakeholder involvement as well. Through, questionnaires, through when you're talking to the survivors, asking them, what level of improvement do you think we would need, or how should we have done this instead, or survivors just talking to you about their experiences and noting those experiences. And then we had, I think it's reformed, but looking at community policing and engagement with communities to ask what is happening in the communities, to get our input as to what should we do. And then we had town meetings at one point in time. But COVID, unfortunately, kind of, we've taken innovative ways, or they have taken innovative ways, but obviously COVID, with that type of engagement, has kind of decreased.
Correct.
But town meetings allow for members of the public to air their concerns, and even domestic violence survivors. I remember in those types of town meetings, they may not air openly, but they will come to you after to talk about what is happening, how they feel about this level of service within that particular division and those things. And we would have noted it for our reporting and as well as development of those programs. Because that is important, because at the end of the day, they are the persons or the client population we want to serve, or we have to serve. So their input, we can't just carte blanche create something and it's very disconnected to what their needs and wants are, or what level of service that they require.
Excellent. And so, and this might be a little personal question here. As a social worker, one of the things that we use, aside from, because we are all most of us in government agencies, so we undersourced, we are under-resourced, we are understaffed, etc. So we use self. Self is our main instrument or tool, because the relationship is key.
Yeah.
What do you do in terms of self-care? Because I always say social work is not a job that I can turn on at 8 o'clock and turn off at 4, because sometimes for some strange reason, things happen after 6, happen after 9, after 7, so how do you, because we're talking gender-based violence, but we're also talking about the elimination of it. And so how, as a female social worker, do you self-care? What do you do, to take care of you when you give so much of yourself
Because as social workers, we are the tool, ourselves, our voices, our, in terms of planning, our ideas, everything that we do is ourselves that we use. Being empathetic, having a shoulder to lean on for the client, is ourselves. Being the middle person between them and other agencies, it's us. And it does take a toll on you. I'm sure you know that. Hearing types of horror stories, really when you put yourself in somebody's shoes to think about what they may be going through. So to de-stress, but debriefing is important in a professional sense. Debriefing is important. Also, just general, watching TV, turning off your phone, maybe on particular time and saying, today is my day to rest and read. Maybe a spa days. That's some of the things that I do.
Excellent.
To the spa. Just ventilate with co-workers in that particular setting to get a sense of what they do, because when you share, you get an idea so what everybody has, and you feel a sense of camaraderie, and we're all in it together.
Correct. Yeah,
because it really does take a toll.
It does. final questions before we invite Wendy
Yeah.
in, see if we get comments. What can we do more? What can we do additionally to improve, to enhance? I don't like to always say change because we have
Yeah.
come a very long way. And like you said, the TTPS has been working in the judiciary. You know, in every little pocket, we have been doing a lot. But can we do? Is there more that can be done?
Always. And I think sometimes we operate in too many silos. I know people say that all the time, and people are very, some persons in particular fields could be very egotistical. It's about me, but it's not about me. It's not about what position you hold, um, or promoting yourself. It is about the clients at the end of the day. And if you think about it like that and gather your team and think about it like that, it's not about just working 8 to 4 and collecting a salary.
Correct.
It's people lives that you are fighting. You need that. Hi, I think it just kind of stick just now.
Of course,
Yeah, so
yes.
I think firstly it needs to really start, yeah, with us first, and then
Yes.
you're looking at, so from a micro level, us, from a meso level, I think persons, or there needs to be some push or drive for education about this domestic violence as well as signs, gender-based violence on a whole in schools. Because persons, especially at a secondary school age level, or even we could go so far as primary because they may be witnessing it at home, um,
Yes.
increases in social workers in schools, because when these persons and clients come to you with the problems, you need a increased human resource level or human resources to treat with those problems. So education in schools, starting it at that level to talk about these social issues that we experience and not being afraid to hear and talk, because secondary school persons are in relationships. I
Yes.
remember a time a case, secondary school person was in a domestic violence relationship in a
Yes.
second, and she and the boyfriend same age went to school, and she's afraid to go to school because he hits her if she talks to somebody else. So letting persons know, and then her mother, and looking at that cycle of abuse, was a victim of domestic violence, so she thought it
Right.
was okay. So having that educational awareness at that level, and at a macro level, looking at improvement in particular policies, looking at in terms of when an offender breaches a protection order, electronic monitoring bracelet, ensuring that it's on stream, stiffer penalties, maybe mandatory counseling for offenders, things like that. So at those three levels, so from the micro, stop being so individualistic, stop
Yes.
thinking it's all about I and where I work, and I work 8 to 4 and I can't give more than this. No, we have to look at pushing barriers, pushing those things.
Right.
There's a community, get education, social work, start from the schools, the church, macro, those changes in the policy. So those are the three ways I think there's some need for a level of improvement all the time.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, Samantha, I know that our viewers would have had a full insight into what is and what could be. And we really would like to thank you, for coming on and sharing your perspective and your insight into what happens in this world of gender-based violence, and really zero in on domestic violence in particular, because I know that is an area that a lot of persons in Trinidad in particular and Tobago, you know, can relate to. So I don't know if, Wendy, we have any questions in our 2 minutes before we wrap up.
No questions, just a lot of positive comments in agreement with what both of you all would have said. I mean, Samantha, you really gave an hour of information in 20 minutes. You really, really gave us some really good nuggets, and people are in total agreement. We acknowledge Director Oslin on the call, one of our directors, and we have guests, Alison, Danielle, Denise. We have a few people on the Facebook Live. So I want to, on behalf of Chavi, again, thank you so much. And and what I'm doing too, I know Mrs. Manning is organizing a roundtable discussion for us. So we will definitely be inviting you so that you can, be a part of, and even, even if you attend, because the conversation goes beyond 16 days of activism. The conversation doesn't end on Human Rights Day. The conversation has to continue, because you highlighted a lot of stuff that would have taken place and a lot of stuff that may need tweaking or advancing or implementing, and the work. It's like the harvest field is ripened, but the laborers are few.
Yeah.
Yeah. So pretty much. So in wrapping up, any closing comments?
Well, I just wanted to say thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Ms. Bailey, for having me. I think this is, Wendy, I know the great work you do. This particular organization, I remember you coming and empowering some young ladies, and that nugget of information and the tough love that you gave them, which it was needed at that time. Talking about that, that always left an impression with me, with our young ladies, as well as, hopefully our young men as well. I know you do work with all. And I'm really happy, Ms. Bailey, too. I didn't know she was a social worker as well until tonight. So it was really good because she understands the perspectives and could steer it in that way. So I'm really thankful that she did that. And during the 16 years of activism, just for persons to be their brother's keeper, continue to be aware. There's a lot of work in terms of with women and as well as men or survivors on a whole in any category of gender-based violence, to be aware, be empowered with the information. We have some driving home of empowerment to do, because where do they get the information? So we just can't tell them be empowered, but where do we get the information? And forums like this allow them to be empowered, allow them to hear, even if it's just 5 minutes of something, what Wendy said, or what is happening, or somebody shares the information. So I'm really, really thankful for this.
We are thankful all around. So we're a bunch of thankful people, because it's teamwork. Teamwork makes the dream work. So thank you so much, ladies. Thank you, Mrs. Bailey Owen, as usual, doing an amazing job. That's why she's our interviewer, because she has a wealth of knowledge as well. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to everyone on the Facebook Live. And tomorrow evening, we're back on the live, same time, with Mr. Raymond Popplewell, a clinical psychologist. So we're going to get it from a different angle. And then, of course, we have Saturday, we have a spiritual view of the whole thing, because we keep missing out that spiritual element. We have Bishop Dr. Dexter James, and we have finance, we have a legal person. We're gonna climax the 16 days really nicely. So thank you again, everyone, and have an amazing evening.